I want to preface this review by stating that this is not, in fact, a negative review. I'm saying this right up front because I just know there's going to be a bunch of tourists who click on this video, immediately dislike, and write a stupid comment without even listening to 30 seconds. No, believe it or not, I did enjoy this game. In fact, I'm going for 100% completion right now, which I certainly would not waste my time doing if I hated it. I'm a massive fan of Resident Evil. I played every single mainline game in the series, and while I have been pretty critical of recent entries, I actually gave the Resident Evil 4 remake a positive review, which is really rare for my channel. That said, it definitely was not as good as the original Resident Evil 4, but I'm not going to re-explain why in this video. I think it's important to clarify that creatively bankrupt does not mean bad. Believe it or not, I don't even think most Ubisoft games are bad, and most of them are creatively bankrupt. It just means that the game has no innovation whatsoever. Resident Evil Requiem, to me, is Capcom just throwing their hands up. They have no idea how to appeal to the Resident Evil fan base anymore, so they decided to make 2 games in one. If you've already played Resident Evil 7 or Village and the Resident Evil 4 remake, you've basically already seen everything this game has to offer outside of a few superfluous mechanics. Well, and one objectively bad gameplay addition, stealth mechanics. They want to turn Resident Evil into The Last of Us. It is so apparent. And yeah, the normie tourists, the people who love the Fallout TV show, eat this shit up, absolutely. But as someone who's played a shit ton of third-person cinematic action games over the years, I'm getting real tired of this movie game slop. What this game really reminds me of is the Resident Evil 3 remake. Yes, this is definitely a much better game, but it's similar in the sense that it was not built with replayability in mind, or the gameplay loop for that matter. This is a one-and-done streamer game. Maybe I'll go back and get the other achievements, but you're never going to touch it again after that. It's strange that a lot of the internet discourse I have seen has really praised the first half of this game when you're playing as Grace, when it really is just Resident Evil 7 again, but even more simplistic and unbalanced, and with additional stealth mechanics that slows down the gameplay. We'll get into that later. For me, I actually really enjoyed all the Leon segments, including the part of the game that everyone seems to dislike the most, the first Raccoon City segment. No, I actually enjoyed it quite a bit. The only real criticism I had is the extreme lack of enemy variety. But that kind of gets back into the overall point of this video, that Resident Evil Requiem is not a bad game. In fact, I think it's a decent game, but it could have been a much better game if it was 2 separate games that each gameplay style was heavily refined and given better progression systems, instead of just stitching 2 half-baked cakes together and then feeding us the slop. And I definitely think it's worth mentioning, even though I'm not really a huge story guy when it comes to Resident Evil because they've been ridiculous for a long time. I have to say, this might be the worst story in the entire series. Not only is it a clusterfuck and confusing, but it also retcons several of the older games in the series for absolutely no reason, and has a Wesker clone that does nothing. He just exists and then he fucking dies, just to establish the fact that they can make Wesker clones, I guess? Oh, and the member berries, dude. Half this fucking game is member berries. Some of the references are subtle, but some are so on the nose and in your face. It's supposed to be on purpose. It is literally just cheap, shallow fan service. But of course, I'm getting ahead of myself once again. This is going to be structured like my normal reviews, where we talk about gameplay first because, well, that is the main reason anyone should want to play a video game, I would hope, is the gameplay loop. Now, ironically, I'm going to start this section off by talking about things that aren't gameplay. The first 30 minutes of this game is essentially an unskippable movie game segment, a glorified walking simulator to establish who Grace Ashcroft is, why she's captured and trapped inside of this crazy hospital. And the problem with all of this is simple. Outside of the fact that if you've been watching this channel for any amount of time, you know I hate walking simulator shit, is that this completely kills replayability. Even if you skip every single cutscene in this section, it is still a mandatory 10 to 15 minutes before you are allowed to just play the game. Then the pacing goes to complete shit as you're given a Leon tutorial level, which is admittedly much more fun than the walking simulator part. Then, immediately after that, you're back to playing as Grace and you gotta play a glorified game of hide and seek with the girl, this giant mutant creature that is burned by light. This feels like the beginning of Resident Evil 7, where you have no weapons, and it legitimately is just an incredibly scripted sequence that pretends to have any amount of player expression or choice, but in reality you do the same exact thing every time you play the game to get through this. Then there's another Leon segment immediately after this part that's another 5 to 10 minutes, which admittedly is actually one of the best parts of the game, so I'm definitely not complaining. I'm just saying it ends up being, while including the cutscenes, about an hour before you're allowed to just explore the hospital as Grace, which on a first playthrough I didn't mind at all. Obviously the pacing definitely felt erratic, kind of like Resident Evil Revelations, for those of you who played that game, where the Jill segments were obviously the best, but then every 20 minutes it would cut away to some other character doing a completely irrelevant thing with different weapons and different progression. But on a repeat playthrough, this shit gets painful, because we're talking about 30 minutes before you're allowed to just play the fucking game. Now, to get into the full meat of the gameplay systems, playing as Grace is very similar to playing as Ethan in Resident Evil 7. Notice how I say 7 and not 8, because Village was a much more action-oriented game. Maybe with Requiem, they figured they wanted to avoid the Resident Evil 6 effect and decided to dial things back a little bit, because Grace is a complete pussy. As a character, she's annoying as fuck. Basically an autistic coward, which I guess represents most DEI hires in the FBI these days, and this is reflected in her gameplay as she can barely take out a basic zombie. On the one hand, it was a good idea to make zombies threatening again, and they have much more interesting and scary designs than the mold from RE7. But on the other hand, because zombies are always a threat, this severely limits the escalation of gameplay, so to speak. There are very few enemy types in this game in general, which, as I've stated many times over the years, I am baffled that normies have no problem doing the same thing for over 10 hours straight. Nobody complained about the lack of enemy variety in Silent Hill 2 Remake. It makes me feel like I'm in the fucking Matrix or some shit. Is the majority of the population brain-dead NPCs? How do you not get bored of just doing the same thing over and over again? But I digress. Because Grace doesn't get significantly more powerful over the course of the game, this means that a lot of the gameplay is going back to the old style of Resident Evil with resource management, which is a good idea. Fairly early on, you get access to a blood collector, which does pretty much exactly what it sounds like. It allows you to collect blood from enemies and buckets of blood that are just lying around, and you can use this to craft all sorts of items somehow, like ammo or ink ribbons for the classic difficulty. But most importantly, there's one item that will easily dominate most of your resources: the Hemolytic Injector. And this is where I hate the stealth mechanics in this game. On top of the fact that sneaking around just makes things way slower in general, the Hemolytic Injector is an instant stealth kill item, kind of like crafting shanks to stealth kill clickers in The Last of Us. The thing is, the Hemolytic Injector works on everything. Way later in the game, it even one-shots lickers. In fact, lickers are such jobbers in this game, it's crazy. Even though they cost like 60 blood to create, it's totally worth it to have at least 1 or 2 hemolytic injectors on you at all times, because it just instantly removes the threat in front of you. On the other hand, I feel like empty bottles were severely underutilized in this game. There's almost no reason to ever distract a zombie that way. You could either position them in a way where you could just run past them, or you could spare like 6 bullets to kill the zombie. Now, of course, if you do choose to kill a lot of zombies without the injector, you have the massive downside of the returning Crimson Head mechanic. Again, this is a good idea. Even though you could argue this is more evidence to Capcom being creatively bankrupt, I think people were asking for the return of a similar mechanic to Crimson Heads forever, including me. So the blister head mechanic on paper is pretty damn good. The problem is the execution just kind of sucks, I'll be honest. I already explained to you why the Hemolytic Injector is the best item in the game, And here's yet another reason. Since it explodes corpses, you never have to deal with blister heads in the first place. Another interesting idea that's completely underdeveloped, likely because this game is 2 games in 1, is the fact that the zombies are more intelligent. Like, this is a mutant strain of the T virus that's similar to the C virus, I believe it was, from Resident Evil 6, where the zombies are a little bit smarter. And so these zombies can talk, and they still remember parts of their life as a human, and you can take advantage of this. Like, there's a zombie that if you flicker lights, he is prioritized to go after it and turn it off, and so you can use that to sneak past him. But there's only a few zombies that have a mechanic similar to this, so it doesn't really come up much. Now, past the halfway point in the game, there is one more Grace segment right at the end where you have to deal with a bunch of lickers. Now, this part of the stealth mechanics actually makes sense because it's been established since they were introduced that they can't see, so you gotta be quiet around them. But my issue is they introduced a new item, the bottle of acid, that instantly kills a licker. As it turns out, your average meth head could take out a licker. And this is on top of the fact that the Hemolytic Injector also instantly kills lickers. And so, what was once a fairly deadly normal enemy, just like hunters in RE1, is now barely more threatening than the average zombie. And you get a bottle of acid legitimately like 30 seconds after you walk past the first licker. What the fuck is Capcom doing, dude? I know a lot of tourists are just gonna inherently disagree with me, but I don't think that stealth mechanics like this fit in Resident Evil. In the classic Resident Evil games, it was part of the skill to weave around zombies with the tank controls to beat the game as fast as possible to get a high rank. That is completely absent from this game. This is more in the style of the Resident Evil 2 remake, where you can shoot a zombie in the head to stun them and then either push them over as Grace, or just straight up run past them during the short stun window. And I don't think that's inherently bad. I think it actually worked out pretty well for the Resident Evil 2 remake, but I don't think it works for this. Maybe because there's a lot more backtracking throughout the hospital. Honestly, I think I'm just tired of slop stealth mechanics in modern games. They're always half-baked, and this is no exception. I don't want to keep beating a dead horse with the Hemolytic Injector, but it really just dominates the entire stealth system. And I haven't really seen anyone else mention this, but for some reason, red herbs have been removed from the game, a series staple that has been around since the very beginning. Now, I have a personal conspiracy as to why this is the case. I think some playtester earlier in development found a red herb, realized they already used all their green herbs, combining them together, and then they were sad. And God forbid any player potentially make a mistake. They might quit the game and not buy future entries. They've been replaced with the med injector, which is just straight up a full heal lying around. My first playthrough was on normal classic, and by the end of Grace's section of the game, I had 5 full heals and several more magnum shots. I could have used magnum rounds to kill zombies, but I figured there would be a big boss at the end. But obviously I'm going to spoil the whole game in this review. I think that goes without saying. But not really, no. The boss fight against the girl at the end of the first half of the game only requires 3 magnum rounds to beat. And even then, you can beat it without using any. So I basically saved them for no reason. Now, I know I've been shitting a lot on Grace's section of the game, but I do see the appeal. There's definitely some great parts of the hospital. I'd say the first one being that it just feels really handcrafted and well designed from an exploration perspective, and there's a decent amount of optional areas. You're rewarded for going out of your way to kill certain enemies, like the big butcher zombie gives you the pantry key. You can even kill the huge ass chunk, is what he's called. I called him Big Fat Baby Man the whole time. And that completes a challenge. And I actually really like the challenge system that these more recent Resident Evil games have implemented. I mean, that's more or less the modern series version of replayability, is getting the in-game achievements alongside the outside of game achievements, which of course unlock alternate guns for your next playthrough and infinite ammo and all that. I also think the basement section with the girl constantly chasing after you was pretty well handled as well. You have to constantly move these batteries around, and every time you remove them from these generators, it steeps the area in darkness, which means the girl can chase you down and chomp your head off. There's also a short segment with a meat grinder, and the zombies can grab you and you both just get shredded. So I thought that segment was pretty intense. So yeah, to sum up the first half of the game, the pacing is kind of a clusterfuck. Most of Grace's gameplay is way too slow. I never was a huge fan of RE7 and 8's style of FPS gameplay, although I was a big defender of RE7 back when it came out. It's not a game I would replay. And Resident Evil Requiem is no different. This gameplay is way too gimmicky and shallow. It's a good streamer bait style of gameplay, but it has very little depth, and the Hemolytic Injector is way too overpowered. That said, the hospital is one of the better locations in the series. I think it's really well designed. I liked going for all the secrets. The average zombie actually being a threat was always a good idea. I like that about Resident Evil 2 Remake as well. Now, another element I actually have to praise about this game is the addition of the ability to switch between first and third person for both characters. For Grace, this is great because there's a lot of moments where I thought third person would help with the controls, and in a way it's almost like a cheat code allowing you to see around corners without zombies being able to see you. But in Leon's case, it's just objectively a nerf because of how closed in the FOV is, and there's no way in the default settings to widen said FOV, but if you prefer the game to be more like an FPS, you have that choice. And maybe some people will find this style of gameplay scary. I've never found Resident Evil to be scary, honestly. Maybe RE7 a little bit, but this is definitely not scary to me, especially not with Grace whining in every single cutscene and stuttering with every sentence. No, that just completely takes me out of the experience. Alright, now moving on to Leon's gameplay. This should be a lot easier to talk about because, I mean, Resident Evil 4 Remake was only 2 years ago. Yeah, it's more or less the exact same gameplay mechanics. There's been a few minor changes that I'd say are pretty much good. Like the fact that when your hatchet breaks now, you can just sharpen it for free. It doesn't cost an item. You don't have to pay the merchant. It just takes a little bit of time, just like sharpening your weapon in Monster Hunter. You can pick up enemies' melee weapons and throw them back at them, or in the case of the giant club, swing it for an instant kill, which is pretty cool on paper, but in practice it just meant I was camping the weapons until the zombies got closer to me. Especially in the case of the explosive canisters, which also explode on a timer for some reason. This honestly feels like a pretty shallow gimmick, but it makes for some pretty cool moments, so I'll let it pass. There's a new gun execution mechanic, though it's kind of hard to trigger. I literally had to watch a video just to know how to do it, and it functionally just does the same thing as executing someone with your hatchet, so I don't know, it's cool, but it doesn't come up that often. Other than that, this more or less just feels like a DLC for Resident Evil 4 Remake, which isn't so bad. I mean, again, I really like those mechanics. There were just certain little issues, especially a lot of the changes that were in RE4 Remake. Not going to talk about it again, but that's the type of stuff I was upset about. I actually really liked being able to parry attacks, even though I'm kind of an anti-parry guy in modern gaming because it's such a common mechanic these days, but I think for Resident Evil, it works weirdly well. Having a way to defend yourself when the enemy's getting close is always good. I wish actually attacking with your hatchet did something, though. I mean, the normal swing is as weak as a knife strike, and the power swing sometimes doesn't even stagger a basic zombie, so it's pretty fucking bad. And speaking of staggering, this still has the problem that the hardcore difficulty in RE4 Remake had, that it can take 3 or 4 headshots on a zombie just to stun them for a follow-up attack. This does not feel good, dude. This has always felt like shit. I can't believe they doubled down on it. It's not like zombies are hard to kill, so why the hell are handguns so comically weak? I know there's gonna be people who would argue this will make the game too easy, but it worked completely fine for Resident Evil 4 and 5. The solution is just to throw more enemies or throw more deadly enemies at you. A basic enemy should not resist handgun rounds, or it's gonna make the handgun feel completely useless, especially as, once again, on normal classic difficulty, I was never even close to running out of ammo at any point. I didn't even use most of my gunpowder items. And the same more or less goes for healing items. The only time I ever ran out of healing was during the mortar section that I'll talk about in a second, where I ended up wasting like 3 full heals back to back. So the only time I was at risk of dying is if a boss could kill me in 1 or 2 hits and I just didn't press the button fast enough. I'd say in general, this is one of the easiest games in the series for both Grace and Leon. I'd say the progression system and the economy for Leon is completely fucked up as well. Unlike previous games in the series, you get money every single time you kill a zombie past the halfway point in the game. This means that it is extremely easy to not only buy every single gun, but also upgrade them all to max as well, not counting the extra tier of upgrades you unlock from the challenge system. You can also buy ammo and a full heal every once in a while, which really further reduces the resource management as Leon. I'm genuinely baffled they left in the ability to craft ammo because you don't need it at any point. After a certain point, you're probably not even going to use the handgun anymore. You'll use the shotgun and the rifle. Speaking of which, the rifle is once again the best standard weapon, just having the best ammo economy because it can one-shot most zombies by clicking on their head, especially with the charm that increases damage if you don't have a scope on, and this really doesn't affect you at all because there's very few times in this game where you have to snipe something. Now, to talk about the actual level design, as I stated earlier, in the first half of the game, you just get a handful of 5 to 10 minute Leon segments to break up the monotony of the slow survival horror gameplay, I guess. I think I pretty much liked all of these. They were very memorable. They felt handcrafted. There was slightly unique gameplay each time. Like in the first hospital section, you use a chainsaw to carve up some zombies. In the section after this, you fight the Discord moderator boss in an attic. And this area is really claustrophobic, and the dude is like slamming into walls and shit. That was pretty fun. Then there's an overly long sniper section, which admittedly was a little boring, but then when you fight in the church right after, it was actually really fun. Very Kino moments in there. That's, I think, the biggest benefit of this style of action gameplay, is that it's not too over the top like Resident Evil 6, where you're like sliding and rolling across the ground and doing these weird gun kata moves. No, it still feels just grounded enough while actually being really satisfying. Now, of course, the second half of the game is where this gets a bit more controversial. When you first arrive in Raccoon City, you need to collect 3 detonator parts that are scattered around this mini sandbox. And again, this is probably everyone's least favorite part of the game. Not mine. But I don't know, people really didn't like this part, and I think the main reason is just that it goes on a little bit too long and there's not enough gameplay variety here. When Leon's gameplay isn't segmented into these mini memorable sections, you just realize how little enemy variety there is in this game. 80% of the enemies are just a zombie. Yeah, some of the zombies will have a spear or a club that they throw at you, but at the end of the day, it's still just a zombie. Even the armored zombie with a chainsaw just looks like a normal ass zombie, and so it completely destroys your immersion when said zombie takes 3 fucking magnum shots to the chest and it does nothing. I haven't even brought up the huge bloater type zombie that it feels like they ripped straight out of The Last of Us. When you shoot the big glowing weak spot, he mutates other zombies into blister heads. Incredibly annoying. This section also introduces one of the worst enemies in the series, the gun zombie. This is starting to remind me of Dead Space 3, when they would have the little necromorph heads drill into the gun dudes' bodies and they just swing the gun around and it would magically hit you. Yeah, that's exactly what happens here, and it is incredibly unsatisfying. Granted, on repeat playthroughs, you'll know just to click on his head a couple times with the rifle, but before that, it's very frustrating to just get shot out of nowhere. And then you have a segment ripped straight out of Resident Evil 6 where these zombies are controlling these futuristic looking mortars somehow, and so there's just all these bombs being dropped on top of your head while you're trying to snipe the zombies and there's other zombies attacking you, and it just feels completely unfitting for the tone this game is going for. And then shortly after this, you get one of the worst like game journalist moments I've seen in a modern game. You know what I mean? Glass surfaces, yeah. I love how we could have had an emergent gameplay moment where I decided to shoot the glass to see if it would break. Instead, the game's like, hey, you can shoot the glass. Hey, did you know you can shoot the glass and they'll fall through? Everything about this section signposts that you're supposed to shoot the glass, but I guess that wasn't enough for one of the retarded-ass QA testers you hired, so you had to just straight up have this wall of text to tell you could shoot it. Then after fighting your way through a couple more waves of zombies, you get one of the worst like elevator ride segments in a video game where you just kind of awkwardly standing around waiting for the zombies to jump on the lift. And then right after this, you can just run past every zombie in the tunnel. I don't even know if this is intentional or not, but it definitely feels unfinished and not the least bit intense because the zombies never even get close to you. The only truly interesting part of this entire section of the game is the spider boss fight right at the beginning. And again, like I said before, so much of this is member berries. Oh, remember the spider boss in RE1? Remember the elevator ride 2/3 of the way through Resident Evil 4? Remember the catapults at the beginning of the RE4 castle section? That being said, despite all of that negativity, I actually really enjoyed this section because it was one of the only times in the game where it's just uninterrupted gameplay for a straight hour. Like, you actually just get to play the game. But after this segment, we also get the most Resident Evil 6 part of the game where you're riding on a motorcycle and it's just an on-rail shooter segment and it's extremely easy. And it ends with a fucking gun jousting section with you and Victor, the Frankenstein dude. While I'll admit I kind of had fun doing this the first time, this is once again a segment that is horrible on replays because there's basically no skill expression, there's no gameplay variety, and I feel like it's such a waste to have the dog enemies only in this one part of the game. You shoot dog zombies in probably 2/3 of all the Resident Evil games in the series, and here you have perfectly good dog enemies in this section that they never use at any other point in the game. The next section of the game is just one giant ass member berry because of course you return to RPD. I'll give my thoughts on this section more in detail when I talk about the story, but there's actually very little gameplay here outside of a bunch of member berries and a couple Easter eggs, which I have to admit the Rebecca photo and Tofu were both handled pretty well, so I can't complain. At the end of RPD, you're forced to play through a flashback sequence, which is basically a ripoff of the Sherry orphanage section in the RE2 remake. I mean, it's literally in the same place. This is undoubtedly an asset flip. You can't even argue otherwise. And it's really boring and terrible on repeat playthroughs, as you would expect. Then you get a boss battle against the Tyrant, which was actually pretty fun. Can't really complain. Being able to parry a super Tyrant was actually pretty awesome. I know some people might argue it was very Resident Evil 6 pilled, but to me, it reminds me of the good old days of 4 and 5's action combat. Then there's a short section where you have to deal with all these Plant 43 vines and a mini boss, and this felt like complete filler. You could easily cut it out of the game and lose nothing. And then we get to near the end in the arc, where we actually have to fight against humans that shoot back at you, not zombies, just straight up elite special forces HUNK squad shoots back at you for just 2 combat encounters that again feel like something straight out of The Last of Us. At least in the second part, you get to unleash a liquor that can distract the enemies and actually kill a few of them, which is a good idea, but again, it's just one and done. This game is so schizophrenic in its pacing that it never has time to develop any mechanics. Everything is just like a one and done highlight, almost Uncharted sort of thing, which probably explains why this game is such an insanely high Metacritic, because normies love their Uncharted slop. And then of course we get possibly the most infamous moment of the game for true fans of this series, the moment that HUNK jobs like a bitch. This felt like something straight out of Reddit, where you finally get your HUNK showdown with the protagonist, and what does he do? He dies in like 2 fucking minutes in a shittier version of the Krauser boss fights from RE4 Remake. I couldn't even believe this shit when it happened. That's it? That's how HUNK dies. After all the shit he's been through, that's how HUNK dies? You've got to be fucking kidding. And the amount of copium around it is insane. I've heard people say it's not HUNK, when it obviously is. It's literally the same voice actor from RE2 Remake. I've also heard that he's not dead because the body disappears after the fight, but who even cares? After he got such an ass whooping, who even likes HUNK anymore after this? And I've also heard excuses. The reason he got such a beating is because at the time of RE Requiem, he should be like 60 years old, and he's probably also dying from this latent T virus infection action, but to me that makes this fight even more lame in context. That is not an excuse. So yeah, this literally just felt like Capcom spitting in the face of the fans to appeal to Redditors who watched lore videos. Truly the worst part of the game, bar none. Then after a short segment with Grace, you play as Leon one last time, you end up dumpstering like 20 fucking liquors in this segment. You just whooping their ass, blowing them up, and then you finally get to the last boss, and I'm not even gonna sugarcoat this, it just sucked. Fighting Victor was just so anticlimactic. I feel like he was just a mishmash of every other final boss since the RE2 remake, except you can just parry all of his attacks. Then he has this really goofy anime over-the-top attack where he charges up electricity and then just slams on the ground, but you can just jog out of the way. It has very little tracking. The only cool part of the fight is that he pulls out an RPG, and if you stagger him, you can pick it up and shoot it to end the first phase. But other than that, I don't know, it just kind of felt generic. And then the second phase is just a gimmick boss that's absolutely idiotic. And I don't want anyone claiming that modern RE is more serious or grounded than the days of boulder punching, because Leon is casually parrying giant nemesis tentacles with his axe. This is easily Boulder Punch tier, dude. This makes no fucking sense at all. You basically just shoot the huge bulbous glowing weak spots, and then he just hacks the thing to death. This is more stupid than Jill picking up a giant railgun in RE3 Remake with her bare hands. So yeah, final boss fight was complete ass. I don't know how people could possibly defend this. This is one of the worst in the series. And that's pretty much the Leon gameplay experience. If that sounded like a clusterfuck, it's because it was. The action in this game feels somewhere in between Resident Evil 2 Remake and Resident Evil 6, which is a really bad place to be. Like, sometimes it wants to be an over-the-top Uncharted clone, sometimes it wants to be a little bit more grounded, and none of its mechanics or combat encounters feel like more refined versions of RE4 Remake. In fact, they feel like inferior versions of most of the encounters from RE4. But at the end of the day, more RE4 is still a good game. When the core mechanics are this solid, obviously just more of the same is going to be a pretty compelling experience, but much like RE5 was a downgrade from RE4, this is a downgrade from the RE4 remake. Now let's finally get into the story. I'm not going to break down every plot event just because, one, I don't really care about plot in Resident Evil anymore because it's so ridiculous and inconsistent, but I am going to talk about the various retcons and out-of-character moments and my personal dislike for Grace. So, in summary, Grace Ashcroft, the new protagonist, is the adopted daughter of Alyssa Ashcroft, one of the survivors of Raccoon City and one of the main playable characters in Resident Evil Outbreak. Alyssa was murdered by some mysterious group, which turns out to be the Connections, essentially the Resident Evil equivalent of the Illuminati, 8 years before the events of the game. And now in the current day, Grace works for the FBI and is sent out into the field to investigate some mysterious murders that are happening at the same hotel where her mother died. She ends up getting captured by Victor Gideon, this evil Frankenstein's monster looking dude who turns out to have a nemesis parasite inside of him for whatever reason, because Victor thinks that Grace is special, and we'll get into that later. Listen, I'm just gonna be honest with you, I hate Grace. I think she is the worst Resident Evil protagonist yet, and I'm not joking. She's an incredibly annoying, autistic, incompetent, whiny coward. She stutters in almost every single sentence.
The mom was murdered, and when she turned into that thing.
I remember complaining back when RE7 came out that Ethan was too much of a normie for Resident Evil, because Resident Evil is not about normal people, it's about seemingly normal people who become mega badasses over the course of the story. I mean, Leon himself is the perfect example. In RE2, it was his first day on the job as a police officer, but even Ethan, by the end of Village, became a badass in his own right, whereas Grace is an FBI agent and can't do jack shit. Yes, I'm well aware the FBI has non-field agents. I'm sure Grace is one of the feds who's collecting every synth cell's personal information during the streams. I know there's gonna be dishonest tards. You're gonna say I'm being a hypocrite or have double standards because, you know, I like Jill or Claire or Rebecca or Ada when those should be girl bosses and woke by my own definition or something stupid like that. But it's obvious that these characters were not made to be girl bosses. They were made because the Japanese thought it would be cool and sexy to have this badass woman who survives this horrific zombie outbreak. None of the Resident Evil girls have ever been obnoxious except maybe Barry's daughter in Revelations 2 before this. But now Grace, I don't know, she's just annoying. And I hate annoying characters, period. Oh, and of course, she only serves one purpose to the narrative that we'll go into later. Meanwhile, Leon is dying from a latent T-virus infection. Apparently, everyone who's exposed to the T-virus has had it in their system all these years, and now it's suddenly sprung up again like shingles or AIDS, and is threatening to kill him and Sherry, who has replaced Hunnigan in this game. But there's a massive fucking plot hole here that I'm surprised I haven't heard anyone else mention. If Leon and Sherry are getting symptoms of the T-virus right now, then why the hell is Chris, Barry, Rebecca, and Jill still alive? Because all of them were exposed to the T-virus in the Arklay Mountains months before the events of Resident Evil 2, and Leon is almost dead by the climax of this game, so shouldn't they all have been dead before this game even started? Now, you could argue Jill is an exception because she specifically got a cure for the T-virus in Resident Evil 3, but Rebecca especially should be dead because she would also have been infected in Resident Evil 0, I believe, right? Whatever, it's obvious Capcom put no thought into this whatsoever, as with many other elements of the story, but that was definitely a thought that popped into my head. Leon is investigating other Raccoon City survivors that have mysteriously died of his disease, which leads to him finding Victor Gideon, who quickly injects a bunch of people with T-virus darts to slow Leon down, but Leon eventually catches up to him, finding the mysterious Spencer Mansion-like hospital that Grace was taken to. Grace manages to free herself from her hospital bed, and after escaping the girl, the giant mutated creature that is burnt by the light I mentioned before, she crosses paths with Leon, but the two of them get separated in a scene stolen straight out of RE4. Oh, and in another scene heavily inspired by Resident Evil 4, Victor chokes out Leon with one hand, just like Chief Mendez, then interrogates him while he's tied to a chair. And I want to point out something that several other YouTubers have been noticing lately. Apparently, this design of 50-year-old Leon was consulted on by actual women at Capcom, so it's completely fine to make a character for the female gaze, but not the male gaze. You know, Grace is this autistic spurg with no tits, no ass, but Leon can be a thirst trap. And am I the only one who finds it disturbing? These are all women like 20 years younger than him who want to fuck him. Yeah, then again, I shouldn't be surprised. That has nothing to do with the plot, just something that annoyed me, of course. And so Grace is now on her own again and has to escape the hospital, Resident Evil style. Along the way, she discovers Emily, a blind little girl that has a strong resemblance to herself. I wonder if that's important. Eventually, Grace comes across a puzzle that she's too dumb to solve because the symbols are in Braille. But there's only 3 different symbols and she has the solution, so she could easily brute force this in just a couple minutes. But whatever, it gives her an excuse to free Emily. But before she can grab the final quartz to escape the hospital, the girl shows up and steals Emily away. In the basement, Grace discovers that Emily is completely fine in a cell full of dolls. Now, I think anyone with a functioning brain and pattern recognition skills would be able to infer that the girl is obviously the other little girl in the cell next to Emily's, but Grace is a moron. After rescuing Emily yet again and barely escaping with her life, Grace finally leaves the hospital and has to side with a black man, truly the scariest thing in this game, to escape in a helicopter. This pilot is the only human black guy in the game that I noticed, and he dies in like 5 minutes, so is Capcom secretly based? I don't know. But to get the keys, she has to sneak into a secret lab, overhears some of Victor alluding to future plot events, and then she has to escape a self-destruct sequence while an army of zombies chase after her. Of course, this is a helicopter in a horror scenario, so a bunch of zombies jump on it, end up crashing the thing. The black guy dies immediately, and then Leon has to protect Grace as she runs away with Emily. Emily ended up getting injured in the crash, so while she's bleeding out, Grace decides it's a good idea to seclude her in a room by herself while she deals with the girl once again. After opening up the roof, the girl finally melts in the sunlight, and Grace decides to shoot her with the Magnum one time for good luck. But unfortunately, during the chaos, Emily bleeds out, and we get a genuinely emotional moment from this game, which is pretty rare in Resident Evil. But then her mutation kicks in, and she turns into this giant gross monster, which Leon has to put down. This is a fake QuickTime event, by the way. If you press nothing, the game will shoot for you after a few seconds. But this moment is undercut in the ending, as I'm sure you already know, but we'll get to that later. Grace freaks out that Leon suddenly killed Emily, and she runs off. Before Leon can give chase, his T-virus infection suddenly kicks in. How convenient. And then we're suddenly introduced to Zeno, a Wesker clone, who is zesty as hell. In fact, for the rest of this video, I'm just gonna call him Zesker. And we're just supposed to accept that the connections can make Wesker clones. It's never explained at any point. And Grace decides to just go along with this obviously evil motherfucker asking no questions. Again, another prime woman moment. Is this game secretly misogynist? So Zesker and Grace head off to Raccoon City, where it all began. As it turns out, there was a secret second laboratory right next to the first Umbrella one that was destroyed in RE2, which contains Elpis, Oswald E. Spencer's last project. And so, as I explained already, second half of the game, you play as Leon. The first section is basically complete filler from a story perspective. Somehow, during the events of the Raccoon City outbreak, the military built an entire wall around the city, except said wall is within the city limits, so there's actually zombies outside of the barricades, so it was completely fucking useless. But I'm not gonna ask questions. Leon blows it up. Victor finally shows up again with an RPG, and you get the over-the-top Resident Evil 6 motorcycle chase. And then finally, Leon revisits RPD, and he gets PTSD from the events of RE2 Remake specifically. Now, there has been a discussion of some other chud-coded channels that have talked about this is proof that remakes are erasing the original games, because all of Leon's memories are the RE2 remake version of the events. Now, to me, this is not surprising at all, because Capcom has actually come out and said that they think the remakes completely replace the originals, which is why they haven't put the OG RE games on GOG. So yes, if there was any doubt in your mind if these modern remakes are meant to replace the original games, they are. They absolutely are. I'm just gonna keep this brief for the sake of time, but I don't think PTSD fits in Resident Evil. I'm the type of guy who vastly prefers when Resident Evil is campy and has good one-liners, and Leon in this game has a few, but this PTSD shit does not fit at all. Resident Evil 6 tried a similar thing, and it was shit in that game too. As I mentioned before, near the end of this segment, you have to play as Chloe, a girl who died in 1990, and was one of the girls that was experimented on from the orphanage that the Umbrella Corporation had control of for whatever reason. Insert Epstein conspiracy theories here. Actually, the game heavily plays into that shit. In fact, there's a plot point that Spencer wanted to put his mind into a little girl. Deeply fucking disturbing, but absolutely believable that the elites would want to do this to themselves. And the way this all connects back is that everyone seems to believe that Grace is a clone of Chloe. Anyway, after a rematch with the Tyrant and Plant 43, Leon makes his way to the Ark, this other lab that had no connection to the lab that self-destructed, and we discover Elpis is contained in this machine that needs a password. And Zesker and Victor Gideon seem to believe that Grace had some kind of biological code that would be able to unlock the machine, which would make sense for sure. That definitely seems like the type of thing Spencer would do, given all the crazy-ass puzzles and strange architecture and his virus experimentation, etc., etc. Absolutely believable. But no, as it turns out, it's just a password. A password literally anyone could guess, by the way. It's just hope. And this ties into arguably the worst retcon in the entire game, Oswald E. Spencer's redemption. Oswald Spencer, the guy who's killed millions of people over the course of the series with his development of the progenitor virus into the T virus, the G virus, T Abyss virus, Ouroboros, etc., etc. And despite the fact in Resident Evil 5, we directly hear him say he wanted to be a god as he's dying, one of the major twists of this game is, no, Spencer regrets everything, and so we have to forgive him, dude, and he just so happened to adopt a girl that looked just like Chloe. This is the part of the game that everyone is confused about, because the implications in the story is that Grace is a clone of Chloe. She just doesn't have any powers. She's a normal girl. But both Spencer, even though he might have been lying, says he just adopted the girl, and Victor in the cutscene after this says, oh, Grace was just normal the whole time. So throughout this game, we come across these clones that were trying to mimic Grace. That's who Emily and the girl turn out to be, right? Grace just remembers a password to a machine. That is her entire purpose as a human being, is to remember a password. I'm not making this up. And dude, get it? It ties into the subtitle, Requiem, right? Oh, haha. And visiting Raccoon City again, that's a Requiem too. No, this is fucking idiotic. And it teaches the worst possible lesson, that you can indirectly kill millions of people. You can torture children. But if you feel bad about it, and you create a universal cure for the viruses, and you adopt a normal girl, then it's all fine. But here's the thing though, Grace being normal doesn't even make sense based on the plot they show us. We see Grace get bitten by a zombie near the beginning of the game, and she shows no symptoms. Now you could say Victor has a magical cure for the T virus, but that can't be the case because even Zesker is suffering from the T virus disease, even though he's a clone of Wesker, so he obviously wouldn't have been alive as long, and he wasn't actually at Raccoon City, but obviously Wesker's powers come from the T virus, so I guess you could excuse it, but it's still kind of nonsense. Alright, whatever, let's move on to the ending. So this is the big moment. You get to choose whether or not you want the good ending or the bad ending. In the bad ending, you destroy Elpis because, I don't know, you skipped every single cutscene and you're an idiot. And in this ending, you destroy Elpis, which means Leon is dying of his disease and Zesker just whoops his fucking ass and kills him easily. And then you just load your save and get to pick the good ending, so it's pointless anyway. Fake player choice. In the good ending, Zesker is an absolute idiot and just injects Elpis into himself, not even knowing what it is. Even if it wasn't a cure for the T virus, what if it just turned him to a mutated abomination? Wesker isn't this fucking stupid. Why is his clone? In any case, it cures him, which means he loses all of his powers. Victor Gideon steps out of nowhere, having lost one of his arms, I guess, when his motorcycle blew up. And he suddenly just goes along with all of this and says that Oswald E. Spencer is a genius and that Elpis was actually a gift of anarchy, not hope. And he wants to purposely release Elpis because it'll disrupt the world order because the connections won't have control over bioweapons since you'll be able to cure all of them, I guess. And then he just straight up decapitates Zesker, which again, I have to ask, why is Zeno even in this game? He dies after like 5 minutes of screen time. They bring back Alyssa Ashcroft just to kill her in 5 minutes. They bring back Sherry Birkin for an incredibly questionable reason that I'll get to in a second. This whole story makes no fucking sense at all. It's held together completely by references to older games that most of the people who are in love with this game didn't even play those fucking games. This is just like the Fallout show all over again. And the tourists are eating this shit up. What a joke. And then you get your final boss battle, which is, again, very limp dick, very easy. And just as you think Leon and Grace are gonna die alone, obviously Sherry came through and backup arrives. It's Chris's squad. Chris himself is nowhere to be seen, even though he should be dying or dead of the latent T-virus symptoms. And then another thing fans are debating about is that it's heavily implied that Leon and Sherry are married, which is really strange given that she was a 12-year-old girl in Resident Evil 2 and Leon is in his 20s. Ada cucks keep losing. and then the biggest fuck you in the entire game, where Grace is still sad about Emily's death, and then Leon just says, unironically, he didn't shoot any of her vitals. It was a fucking mutated abomination. How the fuck do you know where the vitals are? And so, yeah, they managed to rescue Emily, and she's alive in the ending. Oh my god, it's so stupid. This is the worst plot in Resident Evil history. Honestly, there's even more shit I could have covered, but for the sake of time, I gotta wrap this review up. But I guess since I'm being so thorough, I might as well briefly talk about replayability. As I've already implied, there really isn't much. Basically, all you have is the challenge system. There's no mercenaries mode in this game, which I feel like would have been really easy to implement since you've already ported over all of Leon's mechanics from RE4 Remake. But again, this game is so similar to the Resident Evil 3 remake, and everyone rightfully hated that game because it was a shitty remake of a great game. But I guess since this is original, it's allowed to be shitty, and all the shills and tourist content creators will pretend it's the greatest thing ever. But yes, there is a highest difficulty, but again, much like the Resident Evil 3 remake, you can completely cheese this by just unlocking infinite ammo, which is exactly what I did because a basic zombie can kill Grace in like one hit, so I'm like, fuck that shit. And this is another card taken out of Resident Evil 3 Remake's playbook. They purposely make the highest difficulty extremely hard so that you have a reason to use the challenge unlocks. It's definitely not impossible without unlocking infinite ammo, but it's definitely balanced around you having access to the bonus weapons at bare minimum, and even with infinite ammo, there's certain parts that it barely helps. For example, the girl doesn't go down to 2 or even 3 magnum rounds on this difficulty. You need 2 Molotovs just to stun her for a little while. She moves faster, which makes certain parts of the basement really tight. Oh, and I discovered that throwing a bottle doesn't distract her. No, she actually somehow knows, despite being blind, where the bottle came from and will just kill you instantly, so that was great. Most of the Leon segments, it was barely noticeable, except the Tyrant and the final boss have an insane amount of health, taking like over 20 magnum rounds to kill, and especially the final boss is much more difficult than the versions on lower difficulties. Not only is he extremely aggressive, beating the shit out of you constantly, so that if you don't parry every single strike, you're quickly going to be comboed to death, but his stagger meter is so fucking high that 2 magnum rounds to the chest didn't knock the RPG out of his hands, so I had to kill him legit in the first form. But I'd say for the most part, when you have infinite ammo and you're just spamming the magnum constantly, it barely feels like a video game. And I need to emphasize, this is not balanced like professional difficulty in past games. No, this is a purposefully super hard difficulty to give you a reason to use the challenge unlocks. But if you actually use all the challenge unlocks, then it isn't fun. So this is definitely the type of difficulty you just play once and never touch it again. Again, this reminds me so much of RE3 Remake, which people rightfully shit on. The point is, the only reason to replay this game is just to unlock all the challenges, and a lot of the challenges are not really that interesting other than the super secret puzzle that took people a few days to solve. Well, I say solve, they just data mine the game. I mean, one of the puzzles required you to drop like 115 corpses into the meat grinder without turning it on. So I can see why people didn't figure that out naturally. And it doesn't even unlock anything, it just gives you challenge points. That's it. Awesome. So yeah, once you've unlocked all the achievements, I can't see a reason to ever play this game again. Despite my numerous complaining, I have to say this is a decent game. Truly it is. Does that mean you should buy it? I would say yeah, on sale, it's pretty good. I'd say half off or more. You can have a decent time, but it's certainly not a Resident Evil game you're going to be returning to. This one has very little replayability because of all the forced movie game type segments. Even if you skip every single cutscene, you still have to go through Grace's opening walking simulator section and the Chloe flashback, which is like 10 minutes even if you know exactly what to do. I also think there's a few other reasons not to buy this game, like the fact that de novo DRM kind of makes it run like shit on PC, and there's no mercenaries mode, so once you've unlocked all of the challenges, there really is no reason to play this game again. I know people are going to justify this by saying it's on the longer end for Resident Evil games in the series, but Resident Evil 4 was about the same length as this game and had a mercenaries mode and had separate ways. And even though in the remake Separate Ways is DLC, you're still likely going to buy it, and it's even longer in the remake. I guess this will probably get DLC, given that it is easily the most popular game that's come out this year so far, it looks like. I can't even fucking believe its Metacritic is over 90 when this is just a mid-game in the series. Definitely not bad. Again, I have to keep saying it. It's pretty good, but I feel like it's pretty good for all the wrong reasons. It's just piggybacking off of Resident Evil 7 and Resident Evil 4 Remake. It doesn't really do anything original. They just kind of stitch together two unfinished games, and normies are pretending it's a masterpiece. It's actually kind of mind-blowing. That being said, I feel like I can't complain too much. It is better than most modern games I've played in the past 3 or 4 years. It'll, without a doubt, be on the top 5 best games of 2026, which is really sad. But yeah, I really don't like the direction the Resident Evil franchise is going. It's all just a series of member berries, recycling the same gameplay mechanics that have been in Resident Evil for the past 7 years now. Hopefully, Capcom is forced to innovate at some point, but given the extremely positive feedback for this game, I doubt it. That's about it. See you next time, guys.
Don't worry, it's okay.
She's fucking Forrest Gump, man.